Welcome everyone. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for the fifth in a series of 6 lectures about the great engineering feats of the Gilded Age. And the intent of this lecture series, the theme of this lecture series, is to put the Oversea Railroad in context. You know, when Flagler completed the Oversea Railroad 100 years ago this year, it was the greatest engineering feat ever accomplished by a private citizen. And we thought it'd be fun to try to put that engineering feat in context of other engineering feats of the time. So we've had lectures on of course, the Oversea Railroad. We started off our lecture series with that subject. A lecture on Ferris's Wheel, which was America's answer to the Eiffel Tower. And a lecture on the tunnels under the Hudson River into Penn Station that were accomplished by Alexander Cassatt and Pennsylvania Railroad. Last week's lecture was on Mulholland's aqueduct, the aqueduct that made possible that huge city out west called Los Angeles, where our speaker is from today, where I grew up. And today's lecture is on the Titanic. These lectures are all webcast, and about 10% of our audience joins us live on the web from around the world. So they can, our lectures, and keep this in mind for the future, if you're not able to join us physically, you can join us via the internet from anywhere in the world, and you'll see the same slides that the audience is seeing here today. You'll hear the same audio, and then later on the museum edits all of that together with video that we're recording today, and archives it on the website, so that it's almost like attending the lecture in person. And so all of these lectures have a life far beyond today and are available on the museum's website. About half of the audience buys the tickets ahead of time on the museum's website. So if you're not doing that, I want to make you aware that you have that option to buy tickets for any program here at the museum on the museum's website. I want to thank the education department here in particular, and the rest of the museum staff, for helping to put together this lecture series. They do a lot of work behind the scenes goes into this. And of course I want to thank our sponsors, the Palm Beach Post and the Daphne Siebold George Foundation, for helping to make this lecture series possible. Just a pause here to remind you that if you have a cell phone, please take just a second to make sure that it really is off. Not that you think it's off, but it really is off. And if you somehow manage to get into the room without the museum staff stopping you to take your audio tour wand from you, please hold that audio tour wand up so the staff can come and collect that. Those audio tour wands have built-in alarms that are a little bit sensitive to the AV system in this room, and they'll suddenly go off on you, and it's enough to wake the dead. Our lecture today is, of course, on the Titanic. We thought it'd be fun to include the Titanic in the series, not because of the well-known story of its disaster, or what happened to the Titanic, but to celebrate the engineering marvel that was the Titanic and is rarely talked about. And we found the perfect person to do that for us. Daniel Butler is the author of 9 books, a lot of them about maritime history. He's written a couple of books on the Titanic, one on the Lusitania, and others from the same time period. He's living in California now, though he's lived in Florida at times. He was part of the U.S. Army intelligence. He studied in Germany. In fact, he did his dissertation in Germany on the causes of the First World War. So we think he's the perfect person to talk about the subject. He's a self-described Titaniac, which I guess is a term he coined. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Daniel Butler to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Bear with me a second while I get this microphone adjusted, and I get to imitate one of my least favorite commercial series of all times. Can you hear me now? We're good on sound? All right. All right. And bring up the gain a little. How's that, John? A little more? Okay. Well, I don't. Yeah, I tend to get enthusiastic, so I don't want to wind up blowing this out. The first decade of the 20th century was the culmination of 100 years of the most accelerated change in human history, change in society and technologies that mankind had never known the like of before. Between 1812 and 1912, humanity had gone from transportation, communication, production, and manufacturing methods powered by human or animal muscles, augmented by wind and water, to a world of steam engines, steamships, and steam-powered machinery. Now, the new century was one of electric lighting and communications, though as yet electricity was usually common only in the cities and in the middle class and upper class areas at that. By 1912, trucks, lorries, and motor cars powered by internal combustion engines were well on their way to supplanting horses as a means of transport. In less than a century, mankind's rate of travel overland had more than trebled, while at sea it had more than quadrupled. Where in 1912 the best speed a traveler could hope for would be perhaps 20 miles an hour while riding in a horse-drawn coach, a railway passenger in 1912 would routinely reach speeds approaching 70 miles an hour on an express train. Now, a trip across the North Atlantic that once took more than a month was now accomplished in a week or less, and with a degree of safety and comfort unimaginable only a few generations before. The accelerating change was most marked in the last decade, first from, say, 1900 to 1912. In 1900, there had been less than 8,000 automobiles in the entire United States, but by 1910, there were close to 500,000. In 1903, the first flight of a heavier-than-air craft lasted 12 seconds and covered 852 feet. In 1909, Louis Blavard had flown across the English Channel a distance of 26 miles. The years between 1900 and 1910 had seen the introduction of the phonograph, wireless telegraphy, turbine-powered steamships, the electric light, the original Kodak Brownie camera, heavier-than-air flying machines, motion pictures, all of them as reliable apparatus rather than mere technical novelties. The Edwardian world would witness revelations in physics of Röntgen's X-rays, Marie Curie's radiation, and Einstein's E = mc squared. In the psychology of Jung, Freud, Pavlov, and Adler. And in medicine, where the secrets of vitamins, genes, and hormones would be unlocked. Science had been transformed from a dalliance for eccentrics into a systematic discipline, and it had become the foundation of industry. Confidence was probably the single outstanding characteristic of the Edwardians of what in America we call the Gilded Age. Confidence, faith, if you will, in the future and in the belief that no matter how profound the problems, there were answers to all of society's ills and that they would be found. Nowhere had that faith been given greater expression in the advances made in science and technology. It is almost impossible for us today, living in the early 21st century, to understand the almost mystical reverence that people had 100 years ago for technological progress. The engineers and scientists of the early 1900s were viewed as benefactors, their products as benevolent gifts that could only improve humanity's lot. Science and its handmaiden, progress, had in the previous century steadily eroded a faith in God, or Gott, or Dieu, that had sustained men for 2,000 years, until it seemed that the millennium would be ushered in not by theology, but by technology. The construction of the Olympic-class ships, the Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic, so widely believed to be unsinkable, represented the first sure steps in mankind's eventual, inevitable triumph over the elements. And in a curious juxtaposition, the steamships of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had become the secular equivalent of medieval cathedrals. They were the source of endless pride to the communities and nations that built them, and were just as much an expression of men's hopes and dreams of technical perfection as the great churches had once been of hopes for spiritual purity. And as in the days of the cathedrals, each level of society contributed to the great seagoing structure's creation and upkeep. The upper classes endowed them by paying for their most elaborate and expensive accommodations. The burgeoning middle class supplied their material needs by being purveyors of the foodstuffs and sellers, linens and cutlery, fuel and accoutrements that each vessel required in prodigious amounts. And the working classes built them, investing a level of craftsmanship and attention to detail not seen since the racing with Salisbury or Winchester. This is the story of one of those ships, and perhaps the most remarkable of them all, the RMS Titanic. Now, the Titanic's story began, along with that of her two sisters, in the summer of 1907, when J. Bruce Ismay, seen here on the right in bowler hat, and Lord William Peary on the left, turned a dinner together with their wives into an impromptu business meeting. A special relationship existed between the two companies these men represented. Ismay was the chairman of the White Star Line, one of the 4 largest passenger lines on the North Atlantic. Peary was the chairman of Harland and Wolff. At the time, it was the world's largest shipbuilding firm, and for 40 years, the exclusive supplier of ships for the White Star Line. Now, the White Star Line had built its reputation on unparalleled comfort and luxury, and in the first years of the 20th century, the company dominated the North Atlantic passenger trade with a quartet of sister ships known collectively as the Big Four. They were the Celtic, the Cedric, the Baltic, and the Adriatic. And when they were called big, it was no exaggeration. These were the largest ships in the world when they went into service, each of them over 700 feet long, each of them displacing more than 20,000 tons, each one slightly larger, slightly longer than its predecessor. They were the largest steamships in service at the time and the most luxurious. But then in 1907, the Cunard Line, White Star's chief British competitor, introduced 2 new ships that changed everything. They were the Lusitania and her sister ship, the Mauretania. Fast, powerful, imposing, they also carried luxury beyond anything White Star had yet offered, and quickly became the most celebrated ships on the North Atlantic Passage. The Big Four were big. These ships were huge. They were 790 feet long with a beam of 88 feet and a displacement of 43,000 tons. Both ships made over 27 knots on their sea trials, the fastest ships in the North Atlantic, and the White Star Line had nothing like them. Within months of their introduction, they became the most popular liners in service. Cunard, now with the cachet of the blue ribbon in hand, took pride of place in the North Atlantic and began taking passengers away from the White Star Line. Well, it was this stark reality that Bruce Ismay and Lord Peary confronted in the fall of 1907. They had been contemplating building a class of ships that were larger than the Big Four, and with the challenge thrown down by Cunard, those new ships' time had come. Peary and Ismay confirmed the details of the design of a trio of ships to be named the Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic, all constructed at the same design, dimensions, proportions, and appointments. They would become White Star's answer to the Lusitania and Mauretania. If Cunard wanted to build big, White Star would build bigger. If Cunard wanted to offer luxury, then White Star would offer luxury to a degree never before seen on the North Atlantic. Speed would be the only concession that White Star would make. The Cunard ships had been designed using Admiralty expertise with the latest high-pressure turbine designs. It was an area where Harland and Wolff's experience was limited. Now, their plans were ambitious and necessitated major changes in the shipyard. Slipways 1, 2, and 3 were demolished, their place taken by 2 new, much larger slipways, while an enormous steel scaffolding known as the arrow gantry would surround them, serving as a cradle of sorts, allowing workmen access to all parts of the ships as they were being built. In a little over 15 months, the architects and engineers at Harland and Wolff transferred Ismay and Peary's ideas into finished drawings, and the keel of the first ship, RMS Olympic, designated hull number 400, was laid down on December 16, 1908. Hull number 401, the Titanic, was laid down on March 31, 1909. Now, laying the keel is a shipwright's term as old as shipbuilding itself. It marks the beginning of construction, dating from the days of wooden ships when the first timber in the keel, that is the structural backbone of the ship that lies at its very bottom, was carried to the slipway and literally laid down on the spot where the ship would be built. For the Titanic, this meant the day that the first steel girders in her hull were put in place on the ways and riveted together. She was fully framed by mid-April of 1910, and at this point, more than 3,000 workmen swarmed over her growing shape, as her shell plating was gradually laid over her frame and her internal structure was completed. As designed, the Titanic's displacement, that is her weight, would be 52,310 tons. She would be 882 feet 6 inches in length with a beam of 92 feet. From the bottom of her keel to the top of her forefunnel, she would stand 175 feet high. The distance from her boat deck to the waterline was equal to the height of a 7-story building. She would draw 35 feet of water below her waterline and be propelled by 3 giant screws, the outer pair driven by reciprocating engines, the center one turned by a turbine. Now keep in mind that the Titanic was not some sort of one-off freak. She was rather the second of a 3-ship class, which in concept, design, and construction were a well-thought-out progression in the evolution of transatlantic steamship development. These ships were built in an age when bigness, whether in business, buildings, or steamships, was regarded as an inherently good thing, the tangible symbol of progress. At the same time, they were marvels of precision engineering. Consequently, the world was fascinated by the technical aspects of the Olympic-class ships, where everything was executed on a huge scale. Just by way of a few examples, 3 million rivets, 1,800 tons of rivets would be used in her construction. 2/3 of them were driven by hand. Her bow anchors, the side anchors, that is, each weighed 8.5 tons. This one, the center anchor, weighed 15 tons. Each link of the anchor chains weighed 175 pounds. Her rudder weighed 110 tons and was cast in 6 separate pieces that were bolted together. She was fitted with 4 400-kilowatt dynamos or generators that produced 16,000 amps at 100 volts, enough electrical power for a small town. And these dynamos were attached to over 200 miles of electrical wiring. 10,000 light bulbs lit the interior of the ship. The rotor for the center turbine was 12 feet in diameter and weighed 130 tons. And yet, for all of its mass, it was constructed with an amazing degree of precision. The blades were machined to tolerances of 1/10,000th of an inch. The whole assembly so perfectly balanced that a man could spin it by hand. Her 2 wing, or outer propellers, were 23 feet 6 inches in diameter, while the center propeller measured 16 feet across. Her 4 funnels were each large enough that 2 railway cars could have been driven through them side by side. Now, only 3 of the funnels would be functional. The Lusitania and Mauretania, though, both had 4 funnels. So in a game of seagoing, keeping up with the Joneses, the Olympic-class ships each had to have 4 as well. Now, in their case, the 4th funnel served as a ventilation shaft for the engine room and the galleys. Now, just the sheer logistics of this effort were staggering, coordinating the construction, fabrication, delivery, and assembly of literally tens of thousands of components. Now, take the frame members and steel plates for the hull and decks, for example, where the rivet holes were pre-drilled while the plates and frames were being fabricated at the rolling mill, a process which required a very high degree of cooperation and communication between the architects, engineers, and manufacturers. And this was all done without CAD, CAM, or any other computer-aided procurement systems before email and the internet. These men were working with slide rules, pencils, T-squares. They had to depend on landline, telephone, and telegraph systems to communicate with their colleagues and suppliers. Now, there were 9 decks, starting with the uppermost, the boat deck, then lettered A through G, top to bottom, with the lower deck below that being for the ship's machinery, the tank top deck. Above the keel, there was a conventional double bottom, 7 feet deep, which ended at the turn of the bilge, but the hull itself was designed to incorporate a very carefully thought-out arrangement of watertight compartments. This was the most remarkable and highly touted feature of the design of these ships, their watertight construction. Rather than being built with the usual 1 or 2 collision bulkheads forward, and a handful of watertight compartments in the rest of the hull, each ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments of roughly equal length, formed by 15 watertight bulkheads running laterally across the ship. Now, Harlan and Wolff's engineers had learned from the experience of the White Star Line's own Republic which had sunk in early 1909 after being rammed by the liner Florida. And her fate had a strong influence on the construction of these new ships. The Republic was lost when the flooding caused the ship to settle so low in the water that the water level rose above the tops of her watertight bulkheads. The flooding then became sequential and uncontrollable. The designer's research showed that should one of the Olympic-class ships be struck amidships and 2 compartments flooded, the weight of the seawater in the open compartments would be insufficient to pull the ship deep enough that the water would begin to overflow the top of the bulkheads into adjacent compartments. Now, in fact, they could float with all of their last 3 compartments flooded, or with all 4 of the first forward compartments open to the sea. Oddly, though, these bulkheads really didn't carry up very high into the hull. After calculating how having 2 adjacent compartments flooded would affect the ship's trim, the designers determined that the first 2 and last 5 bulkheads need only go as high as D deck, while the middle 8 carried up only to E deck, which at midships was barely 15 feet above the waterline. Now, connecting these 16 compartments were a series of immense watertight doors, which could be closed by a master switch on the bridge, by tripping a manual switch in each compartment, or by a flow-triggered mechanism that automatically closed a door if there were more than 6 inches of water on the deck of the compartment. So comprehensive were these watertight arrangements that in 1911, in a commemorative issue of the prestigious British journal Shipbuilder, published on the occasion of the Olympics launch, the authors of the piece labeled the ships practically unsinkable. Now, before long, and perhaps inevitably, the qualifying adjective was lost to the public's collective memory, and even the White Star Line itself came to believe its own publicity and began to promote the idea that these ships were truly unsinkable. Now, as the Olympic and Titanic took shape, they absorbed more and more of the attentions of the workforce at Harland and Wolff, until the new ships occupied the labor, talents, and skills of more than 14,000 men. From marine architects and draftsmen, interior designers and decorators, carpenters and woodworkers, ship fitters, pipe fitters, electrical fitters, to a bewildering arrangement of caulkers, responsible for cutting clean heads on finished rivets, as well as assuring that the steel plates were sealed tight, to molders, who formed the steel plates in the hull that required special shaping, cutting, or bending, klootmen, who cut cloth for a multitude of uses. But the undisputed kings of the shipyard were the 4-man rivet teams. Now, these rivet teams literally built the ship, for the entire structure of the Titanic was riveted together. Remember, 3 million rivets in her hull. Driving these rivets was a process that required considerable skill and teamwork. Now, first, the heater boy, who could be as young as 12, would work up a fire in a coke brazier using foot bellows to keep the heat up. Using long tongs, he would heat a rivet until it was red hot. Now, the rivets used were squat, nail-like slugs of iron, an inch in diameter and as much as 6 inches long. Once a rivet was ready, the heater boy would toss it up to the catch boy, who caught it in a wooden bowl, hence the name, and then used a pair of tongs to place the rivet into the hole of 2 or more overlapping steel plates. The 3rd man, the holder-up, then placed a heavy hammer over the head of the rivet, while the 4th man, the basher, working from the opposite side of the plate, would beat the tail of the rivet down until it filled the hole. Now, they were strong, tough men, usually more wiry than big, and their workday began at 6 in the morning and ended at 5:30 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. They were paid by the number of rivets each team drove each day, and their pay was docked for badly driven rivets. If it rained hard, they didn't work, and it rains a lot in Belfast. So they worked hard, they worked well, and they worked fast. The record for the number of rivets driven in a single week was set in 1910 on the Titanic, when one team drove over 14,000 rivets. Harland and Wolff was Belfast's largest employer, and the Titanic was the shipyard's largest project. So the 401, as she was known prior to her launch, it's considered to be bad luck to use a ship's name before she's put into the water. The 401 was a looming presence every day in the lives of most Belfast workmen. By the time she was finished, over 106 million man-hours would be spent in the construction of the Titanic. By the end of May 1911, she was ready to be launched into the River Lagan. Special grandstands were built and people crowded the sides of the slipway and the riverbanks as well. It was estimated that over 100,000 people watched the launching of the Titanic on May 31st, 1911. Curiously enough, there would be no christening. That is, there was no bottle of champagne, grape juice, water, what have you, broken across her bow as a signal to launch. Harlan and Wolff didn't go in for that sort of thing. As one of the shipyard workers put it, they just builds them and shoves them in. At 2:10, a rocket was launched, signaling 5 minutes to go. The sound of hammers, saws, bellows, pistons, and engines began to fade along with the noise of the assembled crowd. At 12:14, a second rocket was fired, the signal to launch. The valves on the hydraulic triggers were opened and the restraining blocks of timber knocked away, but for some seconds, the Titanic seemed to remain motionless. And then came the first faint tremor of movement, and the workers standing on her decks felt it and raised a cheer. Hearing this, the crowds ashore looked closely, and then they too could see that the great hull was beginning to move, and their cheers joined in. Gathering momentum, the Titanic slid down the ways, her passage eased by 21 tons of tallow and soap, and into the water until 62 seconds after her launch, after the launch signal was fired. She floated high and proud on the River Lagan. Now, the Titanic was then towed to the Fittingout Basin beside the Thompson graving dock, where she would be completed. The graving dock is a form of dry dock, and this was the part of the original plan by Harlan and Wolff for ships that were larger than the Big Four. Work on the Thompson graving dock began in 1903, so that's how far in advance Lord Peary and arguably Bruce Ismay were contemplating building ships like this. It was here that her engines would be installed and tested, her superstructure finished, her funnels erected, and her interiors completed. It was a process that would take almost 11 months. Twice during this time, she would have to be moved from the Thompson dry dock to make it available for repairs to be done to her sister, the Olympic. Now, in order to move these massive new ships through the water, the Harlan and Wolff engineers had designed the Olympic-class liners as triple-screw steamers. That is, they had 3 screws or propellers. That, in theory, would give them a top speed of 24 to 25 knots. Now, of course, we don't know how fast the Titanic could actually go. She never achieved her design top speed. This was 2 knots slower than the Lusitania or the Mauretania, but it was fast enough to make these ships competitive on the North Atlantic. Now, the heart and soul of any steamship is, of course, her engines. And the engines built for the Olympic-class ships were, beyond any doubt, the ultimate expression of Edwardian-era steam engineering. The design of the Titanic's engine arrangement, as well as that of her sisters, the Olympic and Gigantic, was novel. Conventional reciprocating engines would turn the outer screws, while the center screw would be driven by a turbine, the 3 engines together producing about 55,000 shaft horsepower. The 2 reciprocating engines were the largest such engines ever built. As the engineering journals of the day explained, they were of the 4-cylinder, triple expansion, direct-acting, inverted type, balanced on the Arrow, Schlick, and Tweedy system. I hope you're taking notes. There will be a test. Now, what this means, this was an ideal example of Edwardian engineering at its finest. Rather than spacing the crank journals equidistantly around the axis of the crankshaft, they were sited at carefully calculated offset positions in order to reduce thrust and at the same time, reduce vibration and at the same time maximize thrust. Each engine stood nearly 40 feet tall, and the largest of its cylinders was 97 inches, over 8 feet in diameter, and each engine weighed over 1,000 tons. It could turn at a top speed of 80 revolutions per minute, driving massive 3-bladed propellers that were 23 feet in diameter. Now, taking advantage of the exhaust venting from the 2 reciprocating engines, the steam was bled from the 4-cylinder of each engine and ducted into the low-pressure turbine, which drove the center shaft. The turbine created almost no vibration itself, while the other 2 engines turned in opposite directions, effectively damping each other out and creating one of the smoothest power plants in operation. Now, these immense engines were assembled in their entirety in the Harlan and Wolff Engine Works, tested for proper operation, then dismantled and carried piece by piece to the Thompson graving dock, where they were hoisted into the ship itself and painstakingly reassembled in the engine room. But for the turbine to spin and the reciprocating engines to turn, steam was needed in greater quantities than any ship had ever produced before. To create this giant head of steam, 29 boilers were installed, 24 double-ended, that is with fireboxes at each end, and 5 single-ended. Each end had 3 fireboxes, making a total of 162 furnaces that had to be stoked with coal, 1 shovelful at a time. Nearly 600 tons of coal a day was needed to maintain the speed of 22 knots. The boilers had a working pressure of 215 pounds per square inch. 200 grimy, sweating trimmers, firemen, and stokers who would move the coal from the bunkers, shovel it into the fireboxes, and keep the fires burning evenly across the fire grates, endlessly fed the insatiable maws of these boilers. The boilers stood fully 2 stories tall, 21 feet in diameter. Now, while the engines and boilers were installed, a horde of woodworkers, plasterers, carpet layers, painters, plumbers, and electricians were swarming over the Titanic's interior, completing what would be regarded in decades to come as one of the most beautiful interiors ever put into a ship. Now, we're so often told how beautiful and luxurious the Titanic's interiors were, and this photograph of the grand staircase has become almost an iconic representation of that luxury, and yet the black and white photos of her public rooms and staterooms always seem lifeless and dark, stuffy, almost gloomy. But there's no vitality to these images. And even this view has been repeated often enough that it approaches cliche. But what if we could see the Titanic's interior the way her passengers saw it? A slightly different perspective here at the top of the grand staircase begins to change perception of what it was like, doesn't it? And remember, ladies and gentlemen, these were Edwardians. They were not gloomy people. Victorian monochromes were a thing of the past. They loved color. We see it here in Whitehall. Now this, I submit, is a proper beginning of a grand staircase. The grand staircase descended through 5 decks, from the boat deck down to D deck, where it gave out on the first-class passenger reception area, outside the first-class dining saloon. As you reached the landing, you would pass this magnificent candelabra. There are people today who have the idea that the Titanic and her contemporaries were the early 20th century equivalent of modern cruise ships. No, nothing could be further from the truth. A passenger liner was a means of transportation and not a vacation destination in and of itself. But even more important, nowhere on board in any of the 3 passenger classes was there to be found the faintest echo of the sort of garish paeans to vulgarity and poor taste which characterize the majority of cruise ships today. To make my point, the first-class reception area that I just mentioned. Now, tell me where you find this sort of quiet elegance on any cruise ship in the world. Now, as anyone who's made a transatlantic crossing on a liner knows, the highlight of the voyage is the dining. Now, this is the Titanic's first-class dining room, and frankly, if I had to take my meals in this environment, I would probably starve. But if you add a bit of color, then it becomes a somewhat more appealing place. And if we set the tables, oh my. Now, I, for one, would certainly be tempted to take my time over the filet mignon lily and the parmentier potatoes. Now, if you preferred, you could have luncheon or dinner in the a la carte restaurant. Again, stuffy, boring. But now, let's take a look. It has far more appeal than it does in black and white, doesn't it? The first-class lounge, unquestionably opulent, perhaps even overdone a bit. We've all seen this image, haven't we? Again, lifeless. Not a place I want to spend time. But we add color and it changes everything. It's unmistakable now why this was one of the social hubs of the ship, a room where you would want to spend time with your friends and making new ones. Another social hub was that unbreachable bastion of masculinity, the first-class smoking room, home of silk waistcoats, gold chains, gold watch chains, fine cigars, VSOP brandies, and single malt scotch. Now again, black and white doesn't do it justice. This is a room where a man can enjoy his Monte Cristo and his Balvenie. The corresponding room for the ladies was, of course, the reading and writing room, which, as it turns out, was one of the most cheerful and informal, within reason, of course, in the entire ship. Now, because the typical transatlantic crossing took from 5 to 6 days, depending on the weather, the staterooms in the Olympic-class ships were meant to be comfortable enough for passengers to, if they so chose, spend all of their time shipboard within them, and some did just that. There were passengers who would never leave their cabins save to appear at dinner time, Breakfast and luncheon would be served in their staterooms. Now, B-57, which was decorated in the modern Dutch, makes such thinking a lot more comprehensible when we see it, as did the people who occupied this cabin. On the opposite side of the ship, B-58, was a room done in Georgian style. Think of the Titanic as a seagoing four-star hotel, an Edwardian four-star hotel at that, and everything starts to fall into place. Now, just down the passageway was B-60, laid out in Jacobean decor. Other staterooms would give you a brief history of France with a succession of Louis that would give way to the Empire style of stateroom B-64. There's nothing gloomy, stuffy, or oppressive about these rooms. We've seen the color that's been used throughout Whitehall. Now, the same thing applied on the Titanic. It's just at sea. Now, my personal favorite, because of my fondness for dark wood, is C-63, which was carried out in the early Dutch style. And once we add a bit of color, you can begin to understand why I'm so fond of it. And then there was the parlor suite, C-55, one of two suites on the Titanic which had their own private promenade at a cost of $4,300 in 1912. Today, the same accommodation would set you back over $300,000 for a 6-day crossing. Now, this suite was done in Regency. All in all, the interiors of the Titanic were not designed to overawe or overwhelm the passengers. Rather, they were intended to surround them with what one observer declared to be a silent sermon in good taste. Now, when the engines were completed, work could begin on the Titanic's superstructure and upper decks. One by one, her funnels would be stepped, and the profile that would become etched into the minds of millions of people around the world in generations to come began to take shape. There were thousands of details that required attention, from a final painting of the hull, the completion of the superstructure, mechanical and electrical components all over the ship that required testing, retesting, adjustment. From the steam winches that raised and lowered the anchors to finished planking on the decks using 2-inch by 4-inch yellow pine timbers that were brought over from Canada, to the installation and testing of the navigation equipment, engine telegraphs, telephones, and the electric telemotor wheel that controlled the ship's rudder on the Titanic's bridge. And it also included a complement of 20 lifeboats, 16 rigid boats, and 4 canvas-sided collapsibles. The British Board of Trade in 1912 required that the Titanic would carry 16 lifeboats, enough to hold 962 people. On its own initiative, the White Star Line chose to add the 4 collapsibles, bringing the total capacity to 1,178. When she was completed, the Titanic would be capable of carrying more than 3,000 passengers and crew. At the time, no one questioned the discrepancy, however, for this was supposed to be the Unsinkable ship. A last-minute alteration to her appearance was made just weeks before her maiden voyage. The forward 2/5 of A deck were enclosed, forever distinguishing the Titanic from her sister ship, the Olympic. But at last she was finished. Belfast had done its work, but Belfast was the Titanic's cradle, not her home. And it was time for the Titanic to go to sea. The most impressive sight that the River Lagan ever saw. On April 2nd, 1912, what many would, in the years to come, recall as the finest ship their city, their workmen had ever produced, sailed down the River Lagan and out into the Irish Sea. Forever bidding Belfast farewell, prepared to embark on her maiden voyage, it said that as many as 100,000 people, the same number that watched her be launched, watched her departure. Few, if any, gave thought that for all of her glory, her beauty, her technical achievement, the Titanic was a challenge to nature and nature's God. As within her hull, the deadly triumvirate of arrogance, vanity, and o'erweening pride melded into a physical expression of hubris that would lead to her destruction. For you see, the pitfall of hubris can lurk in every expression of genius, and hubris is always accompanied by its own nemesis. If only the ancient Greeks had known of her, they would have understood the Titanic perfectly. As Anthony said, if you have tears, prepare to shed them now. It happened 20 minutes before midnight on April 14th, 1912, in an extraordinary confluence of circumstances that brought about what Thomas Hardy would later call the convergence of the twain, that dreadful meeting of ice and steel. A 10-second encounter with an iceberg opened up the first 6 of the Titanic's watertight compartments to the sea. She could have floated with 4 compartments flooded, but when that 5th compartment was breached, her end was a mathematical certainty that could be neither prevented nor delayed. Just after midnight, the order was given to uncover the lifeboats and swing them out over the ship's side. And a few moments later, the officers were told to begin putting the women and children into the boats. At 12:15, the first wireless signal for help went out. CQD, CQD, SOS, SOS, MGY, 4146 North, 5014 West. CQ, all stations. D, distress. And distress at sea means one thing and one thing only. Someone, somewhere, is about to die. SOS, the new call, barely 4 months old. MGY, the Titanic's call sign, 4146 North, 5014 West, her position. At 12:50, the first white rocket was fired. The Titanic desperately needed the help of anybody close enough to see her. But this was not the Oceanos. This was not the Achille Lauro. This was not the Costa Concordia. There would be no mad stampede for the lifeboats by the crew, or by men thrusting aside women and children, attempting to save themselves. 4 out of every 5 crewmen on the Titanic would die with the ship. They deliberately stayed out of the lifeboats, well aware of every space they left being room for one more passenger. If the passengers did not take it, it was not their fault. Nor did the passengers panic. Amazingly, for most of the men and women that night, the Edwardian imperatives of conduct would assert themselves. Survivors would later recall how, until almost the very end, panic and hysteria were rare. Husbands would plead with their wives to get into the lifeboats. And men in first class would make the beau geste and stay behind, while third class tragically did what they had always done: wait for their betters to tell them where to go, what to do, when to do it. The Titanic settled slowly, so that for some it was actually difficult to grasp that she was sinking. But by 1:20, the foredeck was awash, and those who had been hoping against hope began to understand that the ship was doomed. When by 2 a.m. the running lights were just below the bridge went under, everyone knew that the end was near. The Titanic's stern began rising into the air. At 2:10, the bridge went under. All but 2 of the lifeboats were gone, and as the water washed up the boat deck, most of those still aboard began retreating toward the rising stern. Bulkheads, frames, and hull plates began to split and shear under the strain, and as deck by deck, the Titanic began breaking apart between her 3rd and 4th funnels. The first funnel collapsed in a shower of sparks. The lights went out completely, flashed back on again, then went out forever. Now, all those in the lifeboats could see was a huge black shape silhouetted against the impossibly bright stars, suspended as it were against the sea and the sky. For a few seconds, she seemed to hang there, motionless, and then she began her final plunge. Standing on a lifeboat less than 50 yards from the Titanic, her second officer heard a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At that moment, he could hear people, husbands, wives, brothers, and sisters, all calling out to one another, "I love you." And with that, at 2:20, she was gone. Of the 2,207 people she carried that night, 705 would survive. "74 years would pass before human eyes again saw the Titanic. Her wreck was discovered on September 1st, 1985, by a joint expedition of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and the U.S. Navy. Time and the sea have inevitably ravaged the ship, and her engines, the mechanical wonders of their day, now they've become piles of corroded, decaying metal. Her boilers, so massive, so powerful, now sit cold, empty, useless. The structure of the ship itself, wrenched and torn as the Titanic broke in two and then further shattered as it hit the ocean floor, has begun to fall in on itself. In a few decades, she'll be gone. At her bow, the Titanic's massive anchors. The side anchor is 8 tons, the bow anchor 15.5 tons. Now they're overrun with stalactites of rust called rusticles. And the monster propellers, some of the largest screws ever installed on a ship, lie broken and impotent at the stern. Her upper decks are beginning to give way and, as I said, fall in on themselves. And promenades that were once walkways for men and women of wealth and power, elegance and grace, now they're home to fish and corrosion. All that remains of the grand staircase, the centerpiece of the most beautiful interior ever installed on a ship. Now, all that's left is a yawning pit. The opulence of her staterooms has been replaced by decay. Her bridge sits empty. It's almost vanished. Her telegraphs and her telemotors once controlled those powerful engines, now control nothing. Smashed, broken, they lie on the seafloor, or across the wreck itself. And the few remaining lifeboat davits seem to cry out to us in their solitude, pleading for just one more lifeboat, just a little more time. The stern, which imploded when the Titanic sank, is now only a pile of twisted wreckage. It's barely recognizable as part of a ship. It's been explored, it's been mapped. In a few years, it will be gone. As much as 80% of the mass of metal in the Titanic has been corroded away. The bow still retains a fragile dignity, but itself will be lost in a few decades when the remaining internal bulkheads finally give way and the wreck collapses in on itself. And then there will always be the memory of the 1,502 men, women, and children who perished with the Titanic, whose deaths assured that her name would always echo within human memory. But it doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. The Titanic deserves to be remembered not just as the scene of a tragedy, for the ship was not a disaster. What happened to her was. Instead, the memory should be rolled back to those few days of glory, those brief shining moments when the Titanic was the queen of the North Atlantic, the most beautiful, the most magnificent ship ever built. This is the memory of her, of the ship herself, of the magnificent achievement, her design, her construction, her engineering, was the accomplishment of the Titanic. This is what should be carried forward when the Titanic showed the world that she was truly a ship for the ages. Please, for Walter. John?
So we're open for questions.
Is there anything? Yes?
Wasn't part of the problem with the Titanic was the fact they were looking to set a transatlantic record, as most ships do on their maiden voyage?
Repeat the questions, please,
Yes,
so the
right.
online folks can
Right. Okay, the question the gentleman asking is it true that the Titanic was trying to set a transatlantic speed record on her maiden voyage? And the flat-out answer is no, she wasn't. The Titanic could not have set a transatlantic speed record. Very briefly, let me explain why. Titanic's weight was 52,310 tons. Her shaft horsepower was 55,000 horsepower. The Lusitania and the Mauretania were slightly smaller ships at 43,000 tons, but their power plants produced 68,000 shaft horsepower. You had more powerful engines propelling a smaller, a smaller, lighter hull. So it would have been physically impossible for the Titanic to ever have beat the Lusitania or Mauretania at speed. Yes, ma'am.
Were all those pictures real? When it was after it hit the iceberg, there's photos on the ship.
Okay.
Going down.
The question was, were the photos of the ship after she hit the berg, were those real? Some of those were artwork that various artists have created. Some of them were stills from the film A Night to Remember. Some of them were stills from the 1943 German propaganda film Titanic. So a little bit of artistic license. Yeah, they were very, very well executed, especially for the given the film technology of the day.
Questions way at the back here.
I'm sorry, this gentleman here and then over there again.
The sister ships you talked about, the Olympic and the Gigantic, what happened to them?
Okay, gentleman asked about the two sister ships, the Olympic and Gigantic. Olympic stayed in service until 1936. She had a very distinguished record in the First World War as first a hospital ship and then a troop ship. In May of 1918, she actually rammed and sank the German U-boat U-108. She was very popular in the 1920s. By the early 1930s, when Cunard and the White Star Line were forced into a merger by the British government, she was starting to get a little long in the tooth. And eventually it was decided that it was time for her to retire. She was scrapped in 1936. Now the Gigantic is a whole different story. Gigantic never left the ways. Gigantic was never launched. See, after the disaster, the White Star Line decided that these pretentious names were not a good idea. So the Gigantic's name was changed to the very dignified but far less challenging Britannic. Britannic was completed in, you ready for this? July of 1914. Less than a month after her completion, she was requisitioned by the Royal Navy, converted into a hospital ship, ran afoul of a mine on the 21st of November 1916 in the Aegean Sea, and sank with the loss of 35 lives. So there was a... Yes, sir?
That was my question. Thank you.
Okay. And in the back, sir?
Are you talking to me?
I'm sorry. There's a light in my eyes. Yes. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. One is, there's much made of the fact that there was a great attraction for wealthy people to travel on this extremely super liner. But wasn't it equally true that the economic factors of the immigration played an important role in their decision to go ahead with this? Weren't there lots of people trying to get over to the United States?
Okay, the lady's asking about the economics behind building this ship. Was it just a ship for the ungodly rich? No, it wasn't. Interestingly enough, the Titanic was actually classified as an immigrant ship. The immigrant trade from Europe to North America basically was the bread and butter of the steamship lines. The money that the steamship lines made off of second class and first class passengers was gravy. So but it was the fact that the Titanic could accommodate as many as 1,000 third class passengers who could buy a crossing for as little as $36 on the Titanic, $36. And the third class accommodation was extremely comfortable. This idea of these babushka and shawl-beclad, poor, tired masses huddled, no, that was not the case. These were, and interestingly enough, the immigrants included as many professionals and craftsmen as it did common laborers and farmers looking to make a new start in the United States. So yes, it was the immigrants that actually paved the way for these ships. Yes, ma'am. In the very back there, yes, sir.
Wouldn't the Titanic have survived the crash had they hit it directly instead of
Okay, the question is, would the Titanic have survived if she had hit the iceberg head on rather than trying to swerve and miss it? Without going into all the engineering equations on this, the short answer is no. Let me explain very briefly why. You have a 52,000-ton ship doing 22 knots hitting an iceberg that can weigh as much as 1 million tons. It's a classic example of an almost irresistible force hitting a definitely immovable object. Something's going to give. The shock of the collision, head-on collision, would have literally traveled the length of the hull. Seams would have been split, engines knocked off their beds, watertight door frames would have been warped so that the doors couldn't have been closed. And quite frankly, there would have been a horrendous loss of life because half the third-class passengers and all of the crew were quartered in the bow. So there would have been hundreds of casualties, even if the ship had hit head-on. And because of the way the energy would have transferred down the length of the hull, her whole length would have been open to the sea. She would have sunk in minutes, not hours.
Were
Yes,
there
right here.
changes made to the sister ships, retrofitting or adjusting the design based on the sinking of the Titanic?
Okay, were the Olympic and the Britannic altered in their construction after the Titanic disaster? That's what the gentleman's asking, and the answer is yes. The Britannic was given a double hull, as she was still on the ways at the time. She was given a double hull, and her watertight bulkheads were raised by 2 decks. The Olympic was similarly modified, although it was not possible to make the changes quite as comprehensive because the ship was already completed, so the design couldn't be modified in process. Ironically, when the Britannic hit the mine that sank her, just like the Titanic, her first 6 watertight compartments were open to the sea. It didn't save her. So the lesson being that there really is no such thing as an unsinkable ship. When you breach over 1/3 of any ship's watertight integrity, I don't care whether it's an aircraft carrier or a river barge, when you breach over 1/3 of a ship's or a vessel's watertight integrity, that ship is going to go down. Yes?
I've always been curious about the rescue efforts because the Titanic was in the normal North Atlantic sea lanes. Why did that fail from other ships that were in the area?
Okay, the question is why didn't other ships get to the Titanic in time to save the people on board the ship? There were the two ships that were the closest to the Titanic at the time were the Carpathia, which was 58 miles away. Now, she had a top speed of 14 knots, so it would take her almost 4 hours, and it did take her almost 4 hours to get to the Titanic's position. The other ship was a small freighter called the Californian, which was actually less than 10 miles away from the Titanic. Her officers stood on the bridge, watched the Titanic sink, reported 3 times to the Californian's captain that there was a ship to the south firing rockets. "What should we do, Captain?" And the captain ignored them. Now, if you want to find out why, you should buy my book, The Other Side of the Night. The other side of the night, the Carpathia, the Californian, and the night the Titanic was lost. I focus on exactly that, the rescue by the Carpathia and the inaction of the Californian. This lady right here.
My great uncle was down at the bottom of the sea on the Titanic. And the reason he's there is that he was in England and he got word that a relative had died over in the United States. He got the last cabin on the Titanic.
You're not a Ryerson, are you?
Yes.
Oh my God. Arthur Ryerson's son had been killed in an aircraft accident.
That's right. That's the reason he caught the boat.
And Bruce Ismay actually made some special arrangements for the Ryerson family while they were on board the ship. Ma'am, this is a privilege for me. It really is. I mean, to meet you, this is a privilege. But Bruce Ismay, who was on the Titanic, the owner, made some special arrangements for the Ryerson family, arranged for an extra cabin for them because it was such a tragic situation. As soon as you said that the son had been killed, I knew you had to be a Ryerson. So thank you for sharing that, ma'am.
Well, it's unbelievable. I mean, I've got pictures and everything else and so on, and they weren't planning to come back if they hadn't had the person killed. So they took the first cabin, the last cabin.
Yes.
And he ended up, of course, surviving. So it's always part of my family history.
Let me relevant to this lady's family history. Let me make a point that's very, very clear. There are social critics who will tell you that it's such a horrible thing that a third of the male passengers in first class survived. Oh my God, that's awful. Social snobbery. Second or third class passengers were sacrificed to make room in the lifeboats for first class men. No. What does it really mean when you say that a third of the men in first class survived? It means 2/3 of them died. Most of the first class men who got into the lifeboats were ordered in by officers because the women would not get into the boats by themselves. Arthur Ryerson, pillar of Philadelphia society. John B. Thayer, Vice President of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Charles Hayes, President of the Grand Trunk Railway. John Jacob Astor, Ben Guggenheim. All right, we're talking men of the same stature and wealth as a Henry Flagler. And they died. And they voluntarily stayed out of the lifeboat. John Jacob Astor went up to lifeboat number 4, escorted his wife Madeline, who was 3 months pregnant, into the boat, turned to Second Officer Lightoller and said, "May I join my wife? She's in a delicate condition." "No, sir, it's women and children only." Astor turned to his wife and said, "To please me, get into the boat. The ship's fully equipped. Everyone will be saved. I'll see you in the morning." Astor was not stupid. He could do the math. 4 lifeboats left. Room for 260 people. There were 1,500 people still on the ship's decks. He knew he was never going to see his unborn child. That's worth remembering. So, we've got time for one last question. Back there, right there.
Who built the Cunard ships and where were they constructed?
Okay, the Cunard ships, it depended really on the ship. Swan Hunter on the Tyne built many of them. The best known Cunard ships, the Aquitania and Lusitania, all of the Queens, except for the Queen Mary II, were built by John Brown and Company, which is on the Clyde in Scotland. The Lusitania was Mauritania was also built by Swan Hunter, if memory serves. It really would depend on which shipyard had the capacity to build the ship, depending on its size and its design. But the best known Cunard ships were built by John Brown of Glasgow. So, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for your time. You've been a wonderful